Change not only brought gains, but also losses. European contact enabled the transmission of diseases to previously isolated communities, which caused devastation far exceeding even that of the Black Death of the 14th century. Europeans brought smallpox, bubonic plague, typhus, cholera, malaria, yellow fever, influenza, measles, diphtheria, whooping cough, all of which the Native Americans had no immunity. Europeans returning home did bring syphilis with them, which, although less deadly, caused great social disruption to the Old World. The initial presentation of syphilis was much more deadly than the virus that exists today and seemed to spread from port cities through armies and mercenaries, often via the local prostitute population, becoming an epidemic in Europe within just 5 years. Overall, this exchange benefited Europeans and those of the Old World more than Native Americans, primarily because of the spread of disease, especially smallpox. Although food products went both ways, the potato would prove to have a significant impact on the population of Europe and became a staple of the European diet for centuries. And in future times, it would be the loss of the potato crop that would significantly increase European immigration, especially from Ireland, to America. By the 16th century, Spanish settlements in the New World stretched from South America to the southern portion of North America. As gold and silver from the New World flowed into the economy of Spain, they became a significant power. Spanish nobility could purchase luxuries from abroad, and Spanish royalty negotiated very favorable treaties, including marriage treaties, with numerous other countries. Spain was able to acquire trade goods, which could be sold across Europe. Sugar would become an important export for the Spanish as it was grown in the Caribbean colonies, increasing the wealth of those who controlled the vast farms and ranches in the New World, at the expense of the native slaves who carried out the backbreaking labor. The Spanish established a system of social hierarchy, where pure Spanish people had all of the power, and mixed races, or mestizos, and Native Americans and enslaved people had little. The mestizos were the products of Spanish intermarriage with native women, creating an ethnically mixed group. In order to maintain the civilization, the Encomienda System was established. By rewarding faithful officers with land grants and the control of neighboring villages and Indian tribes, Spain hoped to be able to better cultivate its resources, while at the same time establishing a support system for its missions. The Encomienda System was designed to meet the needs of the colony's early mining economy. But with the catastrophic decline in the Indian population and the replacement of mining activities by agriculture, the system lost its effectiveness and was gradually replaced by the hacienda system of landed estates. With the West Indies' Native American population virtually wiped out by disease, it became necessary to import African slaves, who had already been exposed to the diseases of the Old World, to take their place. And those slaves were frequently sold to the Spanish by the Portuguese. In addition, missionaries converted Native Americans to Christianity, specifically Catholicism. Having survived wars with the Moors and driving them out of Spain just before Columbus's voyage, Spain wanted to ensure that as many subjects as possible became church members. It is important to remember how important Christianity was to the European culture at the time. Unlike today, there was no official separation of church and state, and politics and religion were very much mixed. So when explorers such as Columbus or Ponce de Leon or even John Cabot claimed land in the name of a king, they were also claiming that land for God, with the intention of bringing their national religion to that region. The Spanish were particularly zealous in their missionary activities, setting up missions throughout the Americas, where priests and other church leaders attempted to evangelize Native American groups. Some Spanish missionaries were kind and gracious towards the native peoples, but others were ruthless to the extent that conversion took place at the point of a sword. The Spanish would create the first European settlement in what is now the United States at St. Augustine in Florida in 1565. They would also found Santa Fe, New Mexico in 1610, and much later began the mission system in present-day California. But since they made little effort to populate the new territories, those territories that become the United States, we're not going to spend much time on them for now, at least not until the U.S. shows a desire to acquire that land that belongs to Spain, and then later Mexico. The Spanish settlements did not take hold in North America as fast as they had elsewhere, mainly due to the lack of large established civilizations. This would give an opening for other nations to gain a foothold. In addition, with the solidification of the Protestant Reformation, both England and France could turn their attention to the rise of Spanish power in the New World and try to challenge it. The Netherlands had also passed to Spanish control and were revolting against that rule beginning in 1567. The strife would last until the country regained its independence in 1648, which of course would distract Spain from attending to its colonies. During this time, Dutch privateers, which were pirates licensed, sort of, by a nation state, would attack the heavily laden Spanish galleons returning from the New World, seizing gold, gems, and other sources. After her ascension to the throne of England, Queen Elizabeth would actively work to subvert the policies of the Spanish. Remember, her half-sister Mary, the previous monarch, had actually been married to Philip II of Spain. Though Elizabeth did not engage in actual warfare, she attempted to walk a very fine line with her privateers, encouraging both English and Dutch sea dogs to attack Spanish ships, although this position would definitely change when the Spanish launched a massive attack against England in 1588, known as the Spanish Armada. The English ultimately ended up victorious, and much of the Spanish fleet was destroyed along the coast of Ireland as they attempted to return to Spain, which weakened the naval dominance of the Spanish. Simultaneous with that Armada and the preparations for it, the English and Elizabeth decided that they were going to start thinking about planting a colony of their own. The Roanoke colony would be the first attempt by the English to settle in the New World. The first attempt at Roanoke was made in 1585 when a small group of men and boys attempted to establish a colony on Roanoke Island off the North Carolina coast. Just a year later, they would abandon it. In 1587, a second expedition sponsored by Sir Walter Raleigh and led by John White, whose daughter was one of the colonists and whose granddaughter, Virginia Dare, would become the first English child born in the New World. They arrived in 1587 to the same site and attempted to settle Roanoke again. The settlement appeared to be doing well when he left to return to England for supplies and additional settlers late in the season of that same year. But the political and military situation surrounding the attack by the Spanish Armada prevented him from returning until late in 1590, when all that was left of the people was a word that was carved into a tree: Croatoan. No definitive evidence has emerged to explain what happened, although one theory suggests that they may have joined with a native tribe and the survivors simply adapted into Native American culture. And so begins the English colonial period. And most of the English successful colonies, or the earliest, are going to occur in the Chesapeake. Now, it is important to know what internal pressures England was experiencing at the time that she began the process of colonization. Following the defeat of the Spanish Armada, the English people were in a particularly patriotic mood and sought to continue that glory, which of course would further embarrass the Spanish. They were also under pressure of a growing population. Foodstuffs influenced by the Columbian Exchange had improved nutrition and caused explosive growth, which stressed the nation's infrastructure. And the population, now quite a bit larger, was desperate for work, especially as the enclosure movement had begun. Land that had previously been farms were being replaced by grazing for sheep, because the English wool industry was starting to take off and was quite profitable to those who participated. As England came to dominate the European wool market, still more farmland would be converted to pasture, further creating high unemployment. Add to that laws of primogeniture, which would limit the transfer of land and wealth between generations, and the increased survivability of children meant that younger sons were looking for financial opportunities of their own, and an overseas colony seemed like the perfect fit. Unlike the Spanish colonies, which were crown financed and crown overseen, English colonies were generally funded by investors who shared the risks and costs of colonization amongst them. They created what were called joint stock companies, where a group of people could purchase shares in a colony, so no one person would suffer a large loss if the colony failed. With the potential for profits, many of England's wealthier citizens invested. The hope was that these new colonies could provide England with valuable raw materials, and that they could also be a market for English manufactured goods. And many of those who were encouraged to settle in the English colonies were dissenters of one kind or another, which would also serve to reduce tensions at home. Now, no further attempts at settlement would happen under the reign of Queen Elizabeth I after the failure at Roanoke. But after her death, her successor, James I, would grant permission for the formation of a joint stock company who planned a settlement well north of the old Roanoke location. 104 settlers would leave London in late 1606, arriving in May of 1609 near the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. They had instructions to build a secure settlement, find gold, and seek a water route to the Pacific. The traditional telling of early Jamestown history portrayed those pioneers as ill-suited to the task, and certainly many were noblemen who were likely unsuited to heavy labor. But many years of archaeological research at the site of James Fort suggest that many of the artisan, craftsmen, and laborers who accompanied the gentleman leaders really did make every effort to build a successful colony. The location they chose was far enough from Spanish settlements to not likely be noticed, and it was a protected site and very defensible if they were noticed. But it wasn't just the Spanish that the English had to worry about. They were almost immediately attacked by the Powhatan Indians, and continuous conflict took a toll on the population. After the injury of John Smith forced him to return to England, the worst truly began. The winter of 1609 to 1610 became known as the Starving Time, when natives set up a siege of the fort, which would limit hunting and other forays for food. Approximately 300 settlers began the winter in James Fort, but starvation weakened the colonists and led to sicknesses such as dysentery and typhoid. The colonists butchered 7 horses brought from England the summer before and were forced to eat shoe leather. The fate of the venture was very precarious. George Percy, left in charge after Smith's departure, wrote in his journal, "Then having fed upon horses and other beasts as long as they lasted, we were glad to make shift with vermin as dogs, cats, and mice." 2 desperate colonists were tied to posts and left to starve as punishment for raiding the colony's stores of food. And one colonist even took to cannibalism, accused of eating his own wife. There were also additional charges of cannibalism, with starving settlers digging up corpses out of graves, and others licking up the blood which had fallen from their weakened fellows. And archaeologists have uncovered forensic evidence of cannibalism having taken place. Of the 300 that entered that winter, only 60 survived to the coming spring. Initially, those survivors planned to abandon the colony, but a new ship of supplies and a new governor, Lord de la Warr, prevented that from happening.